So you'll remember that we talked about how environmental science is an interdisciplinary study. And one of the disciplines that's important to take into consideration would be economics. So economics generally deals with understanding the goods and services that are exchanged between individuals and between countries. And when we talk about economics, generally we talk about economic growth or lack thereof. And economic growth is generally considered to be ideal. So we want the economy to continue to grow. So when we talk about these values, sometimes they're abbreviated as GDP, which is like the gross domestic product. So this is the value of materials, things, and services that are exchanged. We could also talk about the GNP, which is the gross national product, which doesn't necessarily require that a firm, say for example, you could have a Japanese firm in the United States that is doing business, and it would be considered part of the gross national product, but not part of our domestic product. But you don't need to know those. But these are economic measures. And one of the things that they do not take into consideration is the environment. So oftentimes we do not take into consideration the environmental services provided. So, for example, you might not take into consideration when you're looking at bottling water from an aquifer or from a spring, you might not take into consideration that you're actually relying upon that watershed to purify the water. We're not actually relying upon a certain level of precipitation for maintaining the spring, right? So when we talk about environmental services, one of the things that we could talk about would be water and climate regulation. So water formation, right? Climate regulation. And this would include atmospheric gases. So we could talk about the value that forests have in producing oxygen, but also removing carbon dioxide from our atmosphere. We also don't take into consideration maybe the role that pollinators play. So we could talk about pollination. So we know that honeybees are very efficient pollinators, but we also have native bees. We also have other organisms that serve as pollinators. In some places, monkeys are the pollinators for the plants. So pollination would be an example of an environmental service. We also could talk about soil formation. So the formation of good, healthy soil might be due to the microbes that are providing an environmental service. And then we could also talk about just biological diversity and the importance of that. So in terms of agriculture, having biologically diverse crops is really important because monocultures can sometimes lead to crop failures. And so the importance of seeds and the diversity in the seeds are important. We could also talk about the role that that biological diversity plays in just allowing us to develop new technologies and specifically pharmaceuticals. So all of these things are not taken into consideration when we look at the gross domestic product. Other things that are not taken into consideration would be the fact that we have to use energy to actually bring in and accumulate resources. And as those resources then are used, they don't disappear, but we also have to get rid of them, right? So another thing that it doesn't take into consideration is a systems perspective. So when we look at the system, and there's some diagrams in your book. This is a system perspective that is traditional in economics. So you can see that we have households providing work and labor and capital to firms. We have goods and services going out to us from these companies. We have taxes going to the government, and then the government helps to establish an infrastructure that will allow businesses to prosper, right? So roads, interstates, railroads, how are we going to get goods and services, right? Oftentimes that's the government. I think that oftentimes we don't realize how important government, the role of government is. It's kind of seen as a evil entity in terms of business, but really it is the government that provides the infrastructure, right? So the power lines, the sewer lines, right? Keeping everything working is part of our government. So this doesn't take into consideration what is coming out, what is the waste products, right? So if we look at the waste products, energy and materials go into the system, right? We have this exchange, but then the degraded materials have to come out. So that would be, for example, all of the elements that we are now producing, we're actually accumulating, say, for example, copper and aluminum. We're taking them out of the earth and we're making them, and that takes energy to do that. But then also after we use it, where do those elements go? And we talked about this in terms of conservation of matter and the problems with lead. So this recycling of materials is not taking into consideration, and the environmental services are not being taken into consideration when we look at traditional economic models. So one thing that's interesting is this is referred to as a market failure. So this is one of the things that you need to have or understand is a market failure. So this is not taking into consideration other things that are important to our economy. So that would be recycling. When we have a company producing cell phones, does that company need to be responsible for what happens when those cell phones are becoming old and are useless? Like, do they need to be part of the loop? Do they need to close the loop in terms of that? So we also don't take into consideration when we extract resources, how we are degrading the environment and making it so that these services, the things that the environment does for us, are degraded. And so we could put an economic value on, say, for example, the rainforest. And that rainforest could have an economic value in terms of the environmental services it does in helping to regulate our climate. And can we work that into our economics? Now, another thing that doesn't take into consideration this value, this gross domestic product, which is when this is high, politicians are happy, businesses are happy, right? We're happy, 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 but are we really happy? So some people have proposed that we need to take into consideration quality of life. So when gross domestic products, when we're growing in the number of products and services that we provide, are we actually happier? Do we need to also consider our well-being? Is our health increasing or is it actually decreasing? This is not even taking into consideration how sick some that we could become by this idea of it has to be continually growing. The economy always has to grow. And so maybe that is actually making us sicker and more unhealthy and actually less happy. And so there's all kinds of ideas that go around and, brainstorming about how we could change our economic system.